Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the very first author interview for the month of January and the first author interview of 2025. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining us today is a first timer making her official debut on the channel of the new year. She is an author, neurodivergent writer, and editor, and she's been writing fantasy since the seventh grade and self published her first novel at 17 through a senior program at her high school. And she recently graduated with a bachelor's degree in English with minors in creative writing and Spanish. And she discovered her love of editing in college, having worked with her literacy journals, Monocle, and The White Squirrel. Since then, she hasn't stopped fervently jotting down outlines or writing in her limited free time. And our ultimate goal is to become a full-time author. That is the dream for all of us. And her biggest writing hopes are to influence other young adults to write and publish and to have a bestseller fantasy novel. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our official author of the month and of the new year, author Erin Wedemeyer. Erin, thank you so much for coming on the show this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome, Erin. So before we dive into more about your book and your journey as an author, is there anything else you'd like to add about your background?
I like to just say I'm a fantasy enthusiast, so anything fantasy involved, I'm probably there. Video games, movies, TV shows. I like to say especially dragons. My website is dragon themed, so I really love fantasy. Um, and a little bit about me as an editor. I am working on becoming freelance independent editor. So
Ooh,
if you have
okay.
anybody who is interested in editing, please do check out editing on my website. I am offering a big discount right now because I need to build up testimonials.
Mm,
So I would appreciate of your viewers to check me out, and I offer free samples. And yeah.
definitely, I will. So, as a little teaser for our viewers and listeners, what can you tell us about your novel, which is called Vow to Fury?
Yeah, so A Vow to Fury follows Raipana. She's a young indigenous woman. After invaders have come to her forest and forced her people to stop dragon worship, she discovers that the invaders are also killing and hunting dragons, and she is given a dragon egg to protect from them. So the novel follows her journey of figuring out how to care for a dragon egg and also the companions that she meets along the way. It also shifts into their perspectives. And even possibly finding out how to stop the foreigners altogether from hunting dragons.
Ooh, I like that. That almost kind of reminds me of a little bit of like How to Train Dragon, especially 2 and 3, when you have the introduction of dragon hunters. Even though one could argue the first one was about, hunting
Right.
dragons, but that was more about, just stopping them. From what you're telling me, it seems like the enemies in your book are actively hunting and killing dragons for some purpose. And if you want to know more about that, viewers and listeners, we will dive right into that first question. So, Erin, how did this journey of yours come about with this story? I know in your bio that you self-published this when you were 17 years old. Has this story always been with you since the beginning? Were you always a very creative person, or did that come about later in life?
So I started writing, like you said, in the seventh grade, and that started actually with wolf point of view novels. But I've always been fascinated with like small community, native community aspects and cultures. And after I started writing in seventh grade, I moved to Wattpad. I had a little series going on that was epic fantasy, a completely new world, and it followed specific types of dragons living with specific tribes.
Hmm.
And Honestly, I can't remember exactly what inspired me to write A Vow to Fury. But from there, it evolved into, I'm going to do a standalone instead of the series I was working on, and I'm going to actually learn how to self-publish. And because of that special course I got into in high school, I sat down and I had an hour every day, and I have a very creative mind. So I just let my creative mind wander and do what it wanted to write about. And A Vow to Fury was born.
Awesome. So jumping ahead, so once you finally had that copy of your book, and I actually should have mentioned this earlier, do you have a copy of your book with you so you can show our viewers and listeners?
I do. Of course, this is the first edition, so it's not available anymore, as I am currently in the process of rewriting it and writing the second edition and getting that self-published. But this is the original edition.
Nice. I absolutely love the cover. I really, really get a sense. It really, really draws the eye. So now actually having that, so at that moment when you physically had a copy of your book, would you say that was your aha moment in the sense of, I can actually do this? This isn't just, a hobby or just a passion that's a hobby. I can actually write and build my brand as an author.
It's kind of my story is actually kind of funny because this wasn't really when I decided that authoring was going to be my full-time goal.
Okay.
I It was really at the time just a personal goal for me and a personal goal that I'd achieved, and I was thinking writing will continue to be a hobby and I will continue to self-publish things and just write when I feel like it. I had thought that I was going to be a veterinarian,
Oh,
and
okay.
that, if anyone is familiar, you know that the coursework for veterinary school is very intense. And by my second freshman semester, I had 17 hours, but I hadn't had any creative writing courses, and I was really missing it. So I decided, I'll just throw on 3 more hours. What's 20 hours of college work? And when I took that class, the professor actually he took me aside one day and he told me like I was the second best student that he'd ever taught. I was
Wow.
really listening to him and listening to others and applying and growing as a writer. And that, and along with the fact that I was like, I added 3 hours to an already very heavy coursework semester. Those light bulbs kind of lit, and I was like, I'm going to pursue writing more seriously. I want to take writing more seriously and pursue publishing. And so yeah, and then from there it developed into English became my major from biology major. And then the editing came along. I found out I really enjoyed editing and working with literary journals. So now the goal is writing is definitely my main focus, but editing is how I want to sustain myself until I can become a full-time author.
I like that. And that mention of sustainability and growing one's brand and also help, grow as an author, something that we'll be touching on later in the interview when we focus on, the business side. Before we get to the business side, let's actually talk about the creation of Vow to Fury. So let's go back in time a bit. Okay. So you have this story. They're either at your computer or you're on your desk with a pad of paper and pen, and you're jotting down the outline. At that moment, what were the goals you had, not just for yourself as the author, but also the promise to your future readers?
So with the first edition, I think it was definitely just like I said, a personal goal. And I was just more aiming, I was a very new writer, so I was more aiming on having a complete story, having a complete plot, and I wasn't too worried about anything else. And so I think that comes through a lot with like my writing is very heavy in the first edition. I've been told it can be kind of slow in the middle, which is usually a problem with fantasy. And so now, as I'm writing the second edition, I have really tried to keep more of the audience in mind. And I think now that the promise for the readers from this is that following Ray's journey, she goes through a lot of redirects and twists and turns, but she ultimately still is successful in her mission to take care of the dragon egg. So I think that my promise is to the reader is that sorry, my promise to the reader is to show them that determination is ultimately what will keep you going.
Awesome. So now, fast forward after you've written the first draft. I imagine you are now thinking, okay, if I'm going to self-publish this, I need to find an editor and a cover artist, and they have to match what I'm expecting. So can you walk us through that decision of, choosing who is going to be your editor, or if you had an editor at that moment, as well as the cover artist?
So the cover artist is actually, I found them through DeviantArt online, and she's in Poland.
Okay.
I just went through DeviantArt. I think it's kind of diluted now with a lot of AI artists, so it might be harder to find artists through there. But at the time, I just went through and found a bunch of artists whose art I've liked. I've always loved fantasy covers that depicted a scene. So I knew from the start that I wanted a fantasy cover that depicted a scene. I got a snippet of the scene that I wrote. This is, it's like chapter 3. So I sent that to a few different artists whose style I write. I got a quote from them and how much time it would take and if it was something they would be interested in and would enjoy.
Right.
I knew I wanted a dragon, so I went for artists who drew dragons a lot. And Anna is just ended up who was the most beneficial for my budget.
Right.
And I learned how to design myself in Photoshop to do the typography. So that was how I was able to get that over the art. She just did the artwork. I put the typography over the art. And then for the editor, I ended up, I've only had one editor so far, developmental edit it. And that was just, I searched for editors on Instagram. And I spoke with a few, and I went with the person. I got a lot of samples, and I ended up going with the personality that I vibed with the most, and also just once again what went best with my budget.
That makes sense, yeah, because for indie authors, that's the hugest thing is budget balancing. It comes to like, okay, how much time have I put into this book that's going to not to generate the profit, but it's going to reflect the work. The cover art has to match the story. An editor who has good relations with their clients, but also has specialties in those genres is also important. And again, this is all going to be stuff we'll be mentioning in the business side, but this is like a good little teaser of, the struggles of indie authors because everything is out of pocket. And another struggle that I always find very interesting with all authors is the decision of whether or not to use beta and ARC readers. And for viewers and listeners, if this is your first episode that you're viewing in, beta and ARC readers are individuals that we as authors reach out to review our work. Now, beta and ARC readers review the work, but at very different points. Beta readers are typically used before you send your book to the editing phase because you want your book to be almost polished before you give it to the editor. ARC readers, they are readers who read your book, will review it, and post it on social media. And they'll usually get an advanced copy either digitally or print. So for you, Erin, did you use beta readers for your story? And if you did, what was the response like? Were they positive, negative, or somewhere down the middle?
So back when I published it in high school, I didn't have too many resources or connections. So my beta readers were mostly family, and
Mm.
my editor was my English teacher, and he was definitely
Oh,
the one
okay.
who helped me the most. Um, but yeah, I they always caution you about this, and I will emphasize this tenfold. When you want feedback, do not go to your family, do not go to your
Mm-mm.
close friends. Because
Yes.
I mean, I even told them, be serious with me and give me feedback. I want to improve. And they still, they don't want to hurt your feelings.
Right. Yes.
So they're going to be very nice about it. But for the future, for the second edition, I see it a lot nowadays. They'll send out like a forum, and they'll
Mm.
ask people, if you're interested in beta reading, fill out this forum. And from there, I'm guessing they select some people, or maybe they just send it out to whoever fills out the forum. But I do plan to use social media and some of the writing groups and pages I'm in to just send out forums for beta read requests, because I want somebody who's interested in it, generally interested as a reader,
Right.
and also somebody who has experience with reading similar books.
Definitely 100%. And another thing too to add to that is you should never have to pay somebody for reviews, and that's a big thing. And it's true. There are some people and some companies that do pay for reviews. And that's a whole other topic in of itself, but it's one of the many things authors have to be wary of and be alert of. You shouldn't have to pay somebody for a review, because I'm sure you definitely agree, Erin. Seeing stories on Wattpad, sometimes there will be reviews that'll be like 5 stars, but it's just like a sentence or two. That really doesn't help us authors, reach out or get people interested in the story. You can get constructive feedback, even if it's not what you're looking for. It's at least something that can help you improve upon. And so, from those initial reactions from friends and family, did it in a way validate your promise that you set out from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, for the first edition, I was just looking, like I said, to make a story, and I did. I did successfully write a story, and I think back then the focus was on more my accomplishment than it was on the story itself.
Mm.
So, but this is definitely something that when I do get beta readers for the second edition, I will be making sure to question them about if my promise delivers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, speaking of the second edition, that actually leads into another question, one that I like to call the first reflective question. And to lead up to that, I'll just add some context to it. Just like you, my first story I published when I was also in school. I published my first story when I was just getting out of graduate school around the time of the pandemic and, lockdown and quarantine. I had enough time to write on it because everything was all online. So I had to do something to keep busy. And when I finished my story, which I actually have right here, this is The Gathering, my first story that I did, which was, amazing. And just like you, Erin, I did this, just to show that I can create a story and just to have a story out there. But going forward, when I published my second and third book, there was a sense of vulnerability. And I think all authors experience that when they publish their first book. And especially now with social media, it's a double-edged sword. It's hugely beneficial because it helps us grow our brands, meet new readers, connect with other authors, editors, illustrators, whatever. And that's amazing. That's an incredible thing. On the other side, we do open ourselves up to trolls,
Right.
to hate speech, depending on what kind of stories we've written, and just negative feedback and a lot of bashing. And that could be a nail in the coffin to a lot of authors who are passionate about writing, but are hesitant about making that first step. So, for you, Erin, when you made the decision to publish your story for the first edition, did you ever have those moments of anxiety or even imposter syndrome? And if not, what has disciplined you to continue writing and also go back and say, you know what, this story is amazing, but I now have a better understanding of myself as a writer, and I'm going to make a second edition of it?
Yeah. It was definitely nerve-wracking to put my book out there for the first time, and especially Rapana, my main character, is very much me in a different form.
Mm,
So it definitely was a little bit of a vulnerable publish, but for me, this is something also my English teacher definitely told me a lot, is like, if you look, there's always going to be something to criticize. There's always going to be something you're going to want to rewrite or improve. So at some point, you just need to accept that you need to move on. And I think, and there's also, you know, you always hear that, like, just because you like it or just because somebody else doesn't like it doesn't mean you're going to like it or they're not going to like it,
right.
vice versa. Everybody has different tastes. So I was able to steel myself against any possible negative feedback that I would have received by saying, well, maybe it's just not their type of thing, or, you know,
Mm,
maybe they are right. Maybe it could improve this way. But, you know, I had gotten to the point where I was going to be the best that I could with the resources I had at the time. And so that's what it was. That's I can't sit there and mope or worry about how it could have been better when I did the best that I could at that time.
absolutely, 100%. And before we go into the business portion of the interview, I actually was curious about another thing in your bio, which I think it's important to talk about. In your bio, it says that you are a neurodivergent writer. Now, for our viewers and listeners, what does that mean for the lay person? And how did that come about for you?
So, neurodivergent just means that you have a brain type, a neurotype that is different from the normal, or neurotypical. Um, for me, I um, realize that I'm a little different from all my peers. And my manner of being is just a bit different from most people. And so it comes through a bit in my writing, I think. And it especially comes through as I've become more aware of writing for an
Mm,
audience and not just writing for myself. I've found
mm,
that I usually want to write a character that people can find a safe space in, and especially
right.
neurodivergent people.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it just came about as I've I've had a few different diagnostic journeys and everything. It's mostly been self-discovery.
Ah,
But as I've become more comfortable in my identity, I'm becoming a lot more comfortable in my writing process, and just more, it's healthier once you realize you're a lot kinder to yourself once you realize that, you know, you're not just weird, or you're not just um, some other kind of insult or something you might have heard. It's
mm,
just because that your brain processes things differently, and you're able to use that to your advantage.
absolutely. And I also like how you mentioned that how you wanted writing to be a safe space. I absolutely love that because writing should be an escapism. Actually, I think all writing is an escapism from reality because when we read something, we don't want it to be totally like the real world. We want to escape into worlds like fantasy, science fiction, maybe a little thriller, something that takes us out of reality, if just for a little bit. But I love how you said that you wanted to be a safe space. And for some people, it is a safe space, that it's a way to escape and also to heal. and do some self-reflection, which I absolutely love. And that comes through, trial and error of being an author and really understanding what kind of author we all want to be. And that leads perfectly into the business side of being an author. So let's start with the first icebreaker. So obviously you went down the path of the independent author, but I'm curious, Erin, when you were making the decision to publish your book, did you look at the traditional or hybrid routes? And now looking back on it, would you have still gone down the road of an independent author?
Yeah, so because of my personal goals, and it was a more personal mission at the time, self-publishing was definitely the way to go. And also the time constraint, I only had a
Mm,
year to do all of this, the senior year of high school. So
right.
it was definitely the way to go. And I still would 100% recommend it for anyone who's just, if it's a personal goal or it's just something, it's hard to say. I 100% recommend indie publishing. It's just a lot more freedom and a lot more. I feel like I'm more connected to my
Right.
writing. But as I look towards the future, I definitely think I will be a hybrid author.
Mm,
There's pros and cons to each of them.
yes.
Um, and for the main thing for me is like building your community and not having to market yourself. And, you know, I guess the biggest one is not having to market yourself and not having to reach out to the publishing companies, but having an agent to do that would be really
Right.
helpful. Um, so yeah, so in the future, it's going to depend more on the story than it is anything else for me. Stories that are more personal, I'm going to lean towards indie writing. Stories that I think can market easier, I'm
Mm,
definitely going to lean towards traditional writing. As I said, I've really enjoyed working with a literary journal, so I imagine I really enjoy working with a small indie press. So I'd
right.
love to get some writings through smaller presses. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm actually glad you brought up independent presses because I definitely feel, when people go about, the publishing route, whether it's hybrid, traditional, or indie, a lot of us, we all want to go traditional because we all want to get to the big houses. But now more than ever, maybe you have some thoughts on this too, Erin, that there are gatekeepers in the publishing community when it comes to, these stories. And there are gatekeepers, viewers, and listeners. There's gatekeepers in every industry, in every business,
Business, yes.
because, yeah, for our own works, we are virtually to them nobodies. We are just a little speck, and we have these stories that we want to tell. And, from their point of view, I can understand there is a hesitancy to take on these new stories because for them, it's a business. They build their brand, they want to make money, and I completely understand that. However, it is a little deflating when it's a lot more challenging to go into, let's say, Penguin Random House, Simon Schuster, and the other ones on the East Coast. But with that being said, I definitely feel that as authors, we should also look into the small publishing houses that, have a dedicated following who may have existed longer than Penguin Random House, Simon Schuster, Macmillan, HarperCollins, Thor, Forge, Del Rey, whatever, and help them grow. I've known quite a few authors who have gone down the indie traditional routes, and it's just amazing. But that all comes with, the individual, what works best for them, because there's no right or wrong answer to this question. It's what do you feel, as the author works best for you. So from that, Erin, now let's look into another aspect which you touched on earlier, is the authors. Because, for us as authors, you know, we know our audience, as ourselves, because that's who we write to. But when we go about publishing our works, we have to consider, okay, who is the audience? What genre does the story actually fall under? As well as category. Is it adult? Is it new adult? Is it YA? Is it NA? Which I found that's actually an actual uh, age group or something along those lines. And that all comes from research and, marketing. So for you, Erin, this is a two-part question. Do you have a good idea of your audience going into the second edition of your book? And in your opinion, when should an author consider their audience?
So, like I said, I like my writing to be a safe space. And given that Ripana is a lot like me, she's the most main character of the story. Um, in the sense that she knows who she is, she's very confident in herself, but she doesn't really have a community that backs her. So my ideal audience, it's a young adult novel, so my ideal
Okay.
audience is young adult, but specifically people who have maybe been an outcast or who just don't necessarily belong in the community, in the people that they're surrounded by, because I want them to relate to somebody else, to have somebody they can see themselves in. And it as a reader, it brings comfort to me, so I want to bring that comfort to my audience. Um, as for writing with an audience in mind, how I went about it Fury is from the first to second edition. I would say I wrote it for myself.
Mm.
I edited it for the audience. So
Okay.
I think that would be most people's best move, because when you're writing, you want to just get it out. The first draft, you just need to get out all your thoughts. It's a lot easier to cut than it is to add. So, just write for yourself, write what you want to talk about. And then later you can worry about organizing it, making it more cohesive, giving it a
Right.
more definitive plot and everything, and keeping your audience in mind.
Absolutely, 100%. That actually goes along lines of another author who I've worked with. He's actually in my own writing group, Colton, and he calls it killing your darlings, because, it is, part of our story, but it hurts, because it hurts us to remove something from the story. But looking at it with a fresh perspective, we realize that actually was the best move. And going back to, the age group, yours being YA, I always find it interesting when talking with authors who write YA novels, their experience of writing for that, not just the genre, but also the age group. So for you, Erin, did you write it as a YA novel to begin with, or did you write it just, as you say, get your story out there and edit it to be a YA novel?
I would think that I definitely it's my writing style is not necessarily YA friendly nowadays. YA is really thin.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I would describe the writing. But I would still describe it as a YA novel just because of the themes and the main characters. So I think it has always been a YA novel from the start.
Awesome. Awesome. And the next question I'm going to ask you is one, it's probably my new favorite to share with my guests. And I'll give some context to this question. So, a year ago, I had a fellow author on the show, Eric Bowden, and we reached this question. Now, originally, this question was about, who were the authors who have helped you hone your craft as a storyteller. And of course, he gave me all of his favorites, but he turned the question on its head and actually gave a better answer. And that was this response. And he said, I could give you all of the authors, all of the books. But at the end of the day, my book is me. I'm not trying to be like so and so. I'm not trying to be this. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to be me, because I want the reader to understand this is how I create stories. And another thing which he added, which is for all authors who are to do cross-genre stories where, for those who don't know what that means, is where you can write in either, let's say, thriller and then go to romance fantasy or vice versa, or different age groups, whatever. That's when, people tend to assume that, oh, there's like a mix of this and this, or, oh, he writes like this and this. And from a reader's perspective, that's interesting, especially, let's say, an example, your story has uh, Jurassic Park meets Game of Thrones. Now, instantly, for people who have never read either of those books, they have an idea and they instantly expect the book to read as a blend. But as I said, from the reader's perspective, that's engaging. From the author's perspective, not so much, because it pigeonholes us into either one style of writing, one genre of writing, or one style of storytelling. And we shouldn't be restricted. We should be allowed to write different types of stories, go into different genres, and really see what can we do. So for you, Erin, how have you been able to balance these two, your individuality as an author, but also showing respect and reverence to the stories that you grew up with, as well as the authors you've admired?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, I really try to start my stories entirely like from my creative mind. There are definitely various things that inspire my stories, but I never want to write a story that's really similar to something I've written or watched or played.
Mm,
Um, so I think for me, it's always making sure that my idea is fresh to me.
right.
Um, and I can have things that are inspired by other pieces. Like, for example, the elves in my story all live in a giant tree, and it's very similar to Avatar, James
Right.
Cameron's Avatar. They're all living in that giant tree in the first movie. But that's a very minor thing in comparison to the entire world and the entire
Mm-hmm.
plot and novel. And so for me, it's just that the birth of the story didn't come from something else. It came from my imagination. And there are then other parts that I can say were inspired by other pieces.
Absolutely. And it's one thing I actually like to talk about during this portion of the interview, which is, for a long time, I followed these three tenets, which I learned from an author at an author's conference many years ago, which is writers are liars, cheaters, and thieves. We make stuff up, we cheat people out of time, and we always steal from each other because the same story has been told numerous times, which that's not wrong. That's completely
Right.
fair. But now that I've come into my own as an author and really understand my own writing and my own journey, I like to go by the three E's: educate, entertain, and enlighten, because you can do all three in
Yeah.
whatever genre. And I really admire stories that follow the three E's. And I imagine your story also follows the three E's. Of course, we all want our stories to be entertaining. First and foremost, we want the story to be a joy for our readers. But to enlighten them, that is something that takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. And really, it makes sense and it's organic. As well as to educate, because there are a lot of stories in fiction, fantasy, romance fantasy that do blend real life scenarios, real life topics into it. And sometimes that's a hit or miss depending on the subject matter that you are making a comment on. But as I said earlier, it just comes with growth as authors. And speaking of growth, let's now actually talk about the editing side of you, Erin. How did that decision come about that you want to pursue editing and specialize in editing fiction novels? And In your opinion, has that made you a better writer?
Yeah. So I've always really, really enjoyed the creative writing classes, which is generally critique. You read people's work, you critique their work, and in return, they read your work and critique your work. But I've always just loved to give feedback and see that it's been very helpful and seen it applied. Um, and then I eventually took the literary editor course at University of Louisville and joined the literary journal team.
Mm.
So the White Squirrel was a club, and Miracle Monocle was the course.
Oh,
And
okay.
um, I I just really really enjoyed. My favorite thing about reading is to see other people's creativity. So when you're working on a literary journal, you get a lot of different short pieces. So I was able to
Right.
really see a lot of different people's creativity. And I've really, really enjoyed it. And I've been told that I have a really good editorial eye. I can catch things very well, and I can hold on to elements that other writers may have forgotten. Like I usually will catch up on things like, oh, you had this kind of theme going earlier, but it's fallen off.
Mm.
I've been told that was like very helpful. Um, and so it just came about that I have found that I really loved it and really wanted to pursue it and help other people. I want to experience people's creativity, and I want to help them grow, and I really enjoy seeing that growth. And it has definitely also helped me as a writer. When I look over other people's pieces with an editorial eye, I can then relay that feedback I'm giving them back on my own writing. And one of the things that has really come about in the second edition actually is that I've really enjoyed when there was writing heavily influenced by actual events. The first edition is mostly stuff that I just pulled from my brain. I made up on the
Mm.
spot. It was stuff which given the time constraint really makes sense. I only had a year to write and publish everything, so I
Right.
really had to just come up with stuff on the spot and move on to the next thing. But now I've taken some Native American courses. I've read some Native American literature. I've really just fallen in love with Native American culture, and I really want to bring more attention to the effect of colonization and how there's a lot that just got swept under the rug. And
Mm.
um, I've just been able to take more inspiration directly from real life things and real life cultures and history and apply that to the cultures in my novel. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that actually leads into another discussion, which I actually had with a few other editors on the show last year. And one of the things they've always come across, when working with, prospective clients is, of course, hearing the horror stories from the author's perspective. Because, as editors, we do have to be, very critical. We do have to help the authors grow, like really make them understand, it's like, okay, this story is, I like where the story is going, but it may need this. However, there's a difference of, giving critical feedback, but still being open-minded and understanding that there are some aspects of the author's story that cannot be altered. And then you have the other side who just completely alters the story of the author, completely saying, I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for years. Trust me, you're going to love this. And there's no collaboration. So for you building that side of your brand, the editor side, would you believe that, there are going to be some of those clients that you're going to have those stories? And if so, how would you, approach them and tell them saying, hey, I'm not going to be like those editors that you've heard or I've worked with. Yes, I am going to be critical, but I'm going to understand your side because I myself am an author, and I wouldn't feel happy if someone said, this plot's got to go, or this chapter or chapters has to go. Like, I understand.
Yeah. So I've definitely applied some of my coursework to my editing style. And when we had criticism in our classes, we were always told you have to open with something positive. And so I definitely do that in my editorial feedback. I make sure to open with positive to strengthen the author so that they know that I do really like their writing, and the critique is only there to improve them. It's not to critique them, it is there to help them improve. And I do think that editing is also a discussion. I don't want my client to think I've told them this, it has to go this way, and there's nothing else that can possibly happen. I always make sure to say, like, these are suggestions, they're not definitive, and please reach out to me if you ever have any questions or concerns. My first client is someone who we've written and shared writing together for a few years now.
Okay.
And after I edited his novel, we talked on and off every day, probably for like a couple weeks afterwards. And he was just discussing my editing and things that he was like, what if I did this instead? And I was like, that sounds great. And maybe I would say, that sounds pretty good, but maybe also do this. Or I would explain, like, the editing was for this purpose. So when you make these corrections, you still need to fill in this purpose.
Absolutely, 100%. And a lot of my other editor friends would very much agree that there has to be dialogue, there has to be discussion, because you're right. These are suggestions, they're recommendations, they're not set in stone. You can give any number of recommendations to the author, but this is the author's book, and they have final say of what they're going to use and what they're not going to use. And, as my editor friends would say, we have to understand that they may not accept it, but we can be here for them to guide them. And kind of on that note, of guidance, we've always seen, especially on social media, about, these new books coming out, like, first time novels making it huge, and that, gets the fire going. But this definitely leads into an issue that I think you would have thoughts on, Erin, which is, writing for trends or writing for tropes. And what I mean by that, viewers and listeners, is if there's a popular book that's out, whether it be hybrid, traditional, indie, whatever, everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. And that's not even a book. It could even be a movie that came out, or an aspect of a movie that's, generating ideas, and everybody's writing to meet that market. And again, that's a 50-50 thing. You may get it, you may not get it. And even if you do, your readers are going to understand that it's not your work, in the sense that you didn't write this because you're very passionate about it. You just wrote it to, join the hype train. So, Aaron, what are your thoughts on writing for tropes and cliches? And do you think that it damages an author's reputation with their audience?
I've never thought about it in terms of reputation. It's actually very interesting that you bring this up, because this is something I'm very passionate about. Being a fantasy author and going into college, and going into the literary realm, there definitely is still some pushback against genre fiction versus literature. And there's still this general idea that there's literature and then there's books, I guess, genre books. And for me, it isn't so much that one is better than the other, it's just that they're different.
Right.
I personally would never write for tropes.
Right.
To me, if I did that, it would hurt my reputation, just because that's not how I would want to be perceived. But I don't think there's necessarily inherently anything wrong with writing for tropes. If you really enjoy those tropes and you would like to write because you enjoy those tropes, I think that's fine. we could discuss about how that oversaturates the market,
Yes.
and it can get pretty repetitive. But
Hmm.
ultimately, I think readers are going to find you if you're writing something they enjoy, whether that happens to be a
Right.
trope or it's just your story and its uniqueness. There are going to be readers for it.
Absolutely. And I'm also glad you brought up another discussion, which I don't think anyone has brought up, this sort of debate between, commercial fiction books and literacy books, because there is, that debate and discussion. Now, for viewers who aren't aware of that term, Erin, can you just briefly tell us what are considered literacy books?
I think generally literature books are more concerned about the theme of the
Mm,
writing and the effect of the writing, and to some degree also the style and technique.
mm,
Um, they're not they're it generally comes with traditional publishing, I will say.
all right.
It's that there's a certain realm, and once you are in that realm, you are considered a literature piece. That's the best way
Mm.
that I could describe it.
Excellent. Thank you for that, because it is, very, very true that, there are a lot of authors, especially like Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Dickens, Mark Twain. They have specific writing styles that you can instantly identify, like how they approach prose, how they write their characters, and so forth. I mean, Mark Twain doesn't write the same as Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe doesn't write the same as Charles Dickens, or certainly Mary Shelley, and etc. So that is very, very true. And that kind of leads into a very big question and a very big discussion, which I'll give some context for this, Erin. So brace yourself. This is going to be a big one. So I've been doing podcasting and this show for now almost 6 years now. And within those 6 years, I've had the opportunity to meet so many amazing authors from various backgrounds, different stages of their life, hybrid, indie, traditional, writers who write, because they're passionate about it or it's a hobby, poetry writers, even academic writers who are historians, students, etc. And it's just so amazing to learn so much. And I have learned a lot from all of these people. And the one thing I've learned from all of them is this: for all authors, no matter if you're hybrid, indie, or traditional, there are two roads: to be an author and to be known as an author. One is dedicated to the art of storytelling, not motivated solely by capital, but let's face it, it's nice to get a little bit of money here and there. The other side, to be known as an author, is an individual dedicated to the art of marketing, going on shows like these, promoting one's book on social media, going out to conventions, and so forth. Now, both sides have their own hurdles, but generally speaking, the second path, to be known as an author, is the most enticing, because we all want to be known as authors. However, that definitely leads to a lot of unrealistic goals and expectations. And here is the hard truth of the publishing world: there is no guarantee your first book is going to give you overnight success just like that. Being an author is not a get rich quick scheme. It's not a money maker. It's not. I'm sorry to say, but it is true. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. There are authors whose first work did launch them to award-winning status. All the credit to them. That is not an easy thing to do, especially if it is your first book or your first series. But generally speaking, you have this roller coaster of highs and lows, and that again leads to unrealistic expectations, because, and I've had a lot of authors say this, they have known friends who were writers who tried to make money off of this, and they lost their passion because it was no longer sustainable, or may not have been sustainable to begin with. And it's unfortunate, but it is a hard truth to really, bring to the forefront. So, Erin, I turn to you to add your thoughts to this discussion of, there is no guarantee your first book is going to give you the success you want. However, it should not deter somebody from writing if being a writer, being a storyteller is something they are truly passionate about.
Yeah, so when I was looking into becoming a full-time author, I knew from the get-go that most people who can become a full-time author, it's once they have, I think it might be more or less now, but when I was looking at it back in beginning of college, it was between 6 and 10 books is when you would have enough to make enough from your books to be a full-time author.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so for me, I knew right away it wasn't something that I would be able to just sit down and write and that would be the rest of my life. But I think there is definitely, you can't, you have to enjoy writing. You have
Yes.
to love writing in order to make it as an author, in order to make it as a known author. There's
Mm-hmm.
no fake it till you make it in this. You definitely have to enjoy writing and critiquing yourself and improving yourself and everything to become an author. Yeah.
Absolutely. And also to add to that, well, two things to add to that. It's also the mindset too. And actually, one author um, said this beautifully. Antoine, who was on the show last year, said that it's either you're a writer who is, writing for a hobby, or you're a commercial writer where you're understanding the market, you knowing what's popular, you know what people are reading more than anyone else. So it's that mindset too. And also to add to that, it's okay if your first book doesn't give you the success you want, because as authors, we only get better as time goes on. I had one guest on the show, Natalie Wright, author of Season of the Dragon. Her book, Season of the Dragon, was her seventh book, and that's the book she's most well known for. And I didn't know that at the time when I interviewed her. I thought that was her first book.
Oh wow.
But yeah, but she gave me that great piece of advice that it may be your sixth, seventh, 10th, or 20th book that gets your name out there. That is perfectly fine. And she also added to this, which is we need to be okay with our first book not being the one that we are most known for. That was a hard pill to swallow at the time, but she's right. Our first book may not be the one we're most known for. It just gets our foot in the door, and that's okay. That is fine. It opens doors for new relationships in the publishing world, meeting new authors and so forth. And speaking of meeting new authors, connection and growing one's brand is very huge for authors. So, Erin, are there any personal shout outs you would like to give to on the show, people who have helped you either with your writing, your editing, or have referred you to artists, or just people who have just been by your side since the beginning?
Oh yeah, well, for sure, I'll have to start with my husband. We just got married actually in October, and we have been together since the 8th grade.
Oh, congratulations.
So thanks. This is our 10 years going on 11, and he has definitely supported me through everything. He's always supported me when I've been at my lowest points, when I've been at my highest points. He's always there for me. And as for writers, my college professor, who has really helped me with the second edition and has really just, I go back to the college every now and then for readings and things, and he always checks in and sees how I'm doing and how it's coming along, and he always says, don't give up, keep going. His name's Paul Greiner, and I have two writing friends who we've been sharing each other's work for a long time now. Michael Albers and Bradley Terry. They don't have any published work yet, but I definitely want to shout them out because they have definitely just helped me continue. And sometimes it's not even with um, encouraging words. It's just simply asking how I'm doing and keeping me in check to make sure I am still making progress of some kind. They've just always been there.
Awesome. That's incredible, Erin. Now, before we get to the last question, there is an old question that I'm going to ask you, and it's one I haven't asked a guest in a very, very long time, and it's this. Now, we may have touched on this a little bit when we talked to you, about writing for tropes and stuff like that, but I definitely feel there is a little, bit of, I'm not the one I'm thinking of, but whenever we go out to conferences or ever we're tabling or just meeting fellow authors and just talking about our books, it's really an uplifting feeling when either it's an author we followed on Instagram or an author we've admired, talking about our books and giving credit where credit is due. So the question I ask you, Erin, is, from your journey up to this point, have you ever gotten a sense of validation from fellow authors who have either read your story either in the early stages or have purchased a copy and have given credit where credit is due? Because it's one thing to go into any industry with the knowledge that you've learned along the way. It's another thing entirely when your peers recognize your talent and give you due diligence.
Yeah, actually, when you sent over the questions for me to look over and you had asked about what motivates me, I actually said that on the one hand, readers who enjoy the story, but I think what really motivates me the most is when other writers comment on where they can see the skills that I have and can point out things that I do really well, because these are things that I've been working on since I published the first edition and things I've been trying to improve. So when there's a writer's eye on it and they know the work that has gone into it and they can compliment you on that work, it just really validates all, not just your writing, but just all the work that you have done to get the writing to that level. So yeah, there's definitely points throughout college and classes, but also I tabled a couple events with the first edition, and there'd be other authors who would come to my table and congratulate me and tell me don't give up on my dream of becoming a full-time author. So it's definitely a very great feeling to have other writers and authors compliment your work and recognize the skills that have gone into it.
Absolutely, 100%. And now we've reached the end of this amazing interview. So here is the final question, Erin. With everything you've learned thus far on your journey, from writing this story in high school, learning new skills in college, and rewriting your story, re-editing it for the second edition, and now working on your brand as being not just an author, but also an editor, and earning rapport with your future clients, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors watching this interview right now?
One of the biggest things is to be kind to yourself. It is very easy to get down on yourself. It is very easy to see where you are lacking. And this is actually a blog post that I've been meaning to go back and rework and republish, is just celebrate your victories. When you sit down to write for 30 minutes and you only write a sentence, do not say I only wrote a sentence. Say I wrote a sentence. Celebrate that you wrote something. You have to always find the positives, because when you start looking, it's very easy, especially with imposter syndrome too. Like I said, it's just very easy to just find the negatives and look at those and get down on yourself. And that mindset will and ultimately keep you from writing more. So you have to make sure that you are being positive and you are always encouraging yourself. And especially for my fellow neurodivergent writers, you also have to give yourself rest. If your mind is telling yourself that it can't, you need to respect it and give it rest. This has been a very hard lesson for me. I've always been very perfectionist, very critical about making some kind of progress. But if you're always pushing yourself and you never give yourself the rest that your body is asking for, you are not going to proceed like you want. So yes, be positive and also give yourself rest when you need to.
Absolutely 100%. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this very first author interview for the month of January and the first author interview of 2025. I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, Erin Wedemeyer, for coming on the show, making her official debut, telling us all about her story, about a Fury, as well as her editing services. Now, Erin, where can people find you on social media to reach out, to talk about your book, as well as inquire about your editing services?
I just have it all under one account right now. It's on Facebook and Instagram. Just look up Erin Wedemeyer, author Erin Wedemeyer. And also, I have my own website, erinwfantasyauthor.com. That is also for my editing services. I just have a separate page for that.
Awesome. And when can readers expect the second edition of About to Fury to become available for purchase?
Well, I've been telling myself this year for the past 3 years. But I really do hope soon, probably next year. That would be ultimately the best. I am about halfway through rewriting it, but I do also want to take some time to research marketing and everything before I release it. So even though I hopefully will finish writing it this year, I do want to give myself some time to build up marketing and learn how to really set myself up for success. So I will say hopefully next year.
Awesome. I will link all that down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for a late night author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to Erin for coming on the show. We cannot wait to see what this year has in store for her. We cannot wait to pick up a copy of Avowed to Fury. And if you have the first edition of Avowed to Fury and you are ready to share it, definitely do it. Post it on Instagram, share it with a friend, share it word of mouth, write a blog about it, because that is what's going to generate, interest, because that is what drives us as authors. It's the reviews, it's the feedback from our readers, from our fans and our followers, because to be honest, as authors, we're nothing without our readers and our fans, because they keep us accountable, and we love the amount of respect we gain from them. So with that, viewers and listeners, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world.